The Mystery of Cloomber by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 11. Of the Casting Away of the Bark Belinda. The 3rd of October had broken auspiciously with a bright sun and a cloudless sky. There had in the morning been a slight breeze, and a few little white wreaths of vapor drifted here and there like the scattered feathers of some gigantic bird. But as the day wore on, such wind as there was fell completely away, and the air became close and stagnant. The sun blazed down with a degree of heat which was remarkable so late in the season, and a shimmering haze lay upon the upland moors and concealed the Irish mountains on the other side of the channel. The sea itself rose and fell in a long, heavy, oily roll, sweeping slowly landward and breaking suddenly, with a dull, monotonous booming upon the rock-girt shore. To the inexperienced, all seemed calm and peaceful, but to those who are accustomed to read nature's warnings, there was a dark menace in air and sky and sea. My sister and I walked out in the afternoon, sauntering slowly along the margin of the great sandy pit which shoots out into the Irish Sea, flanking upon one side the magnificent Bay of Luce, and on the other the more obscure inlet of Kirkmaiden, on the shores of which the Branksome property is situated. It was too surly to go far, so we soon seated ourselves upon one of the sandy hillocks, overgrown with faded grass turfs, which extend along the coastline and which form nature's dikes against the encroachments of the ocean. Our rest was soon interrupted by the scrunching of heavy boots upon the shingle, and Jamieson, the old men-of-war's man whom I have already had occasion to mention, made his appearance with the flat circular net upon his back, which he used for shrimp catching. He came towards us upon seeing us, and said in his rough, kindly way that he hoped we would not take it amiss if he sent us a dish of shrimp for our tea at Branksome. "I make a good catch before the storm," he remarked. "You think there's going to be a storm, then?" I asked. "Why, even a marine could see that," he answered, sticking a great wedge of tobacco in his cheek. "The moors over near Cloomber are just white with gulls and kittiwakes. And did you think they come ashore for except to escape, having all the feathers blown out of them? I mind a day like this when I was with Charlie Napier off Crostant. It well nigh blew us under the guns of the forts for all our engines and propellers." "Have you ever known a wreck in these parts?" I asked. "Lord love ye, sir, it's a famous place for wrecks. Why, in that very bay down there, 2 of the King Philip's first-rates floundered, with all hands in the days of the Spanish War. If that sheet of water in the Bay of Luce round the corner could tell their aim tale, they'd have a gay lot to speak of. When the Judgment Day comes round, that water will just be bubbling with the number of folks that will be coming up from the bottom." "I trust that there will be no wrecks while we are here," said Esther earnestly. The old man shook his grizzled head and looked distrustfully at the hazy horizon. "If it blows from the west," he said, "some of these sailing ships may find it no joke to be caught without sea room in the North Channel. There's the bark out yonder. I dare say her maidster would be glad enough to find himself safe in the side." "She seems to be absolutely motionless," I remarked, looking at the vessel in question, whose black hull and gleaming sails rose and fell slowly with the throbbing of the giant pulse beneath her. "Perhaps, Jamieson, we are wrong, and there will be no storm after all." The old sailor chuckled to himself with an air of superior knowledge, and shuffled away with his shrimp net while my sister and I walked slowly homewards through the hot and stagnant air. I went up to my father's study to see if the old gentleman had any instructions as to the estate, for he had become engrossed in a new work upon Oriental literature, and the practical management of the property had, in consequence, devolved entirely upon me. I found him seated at his square library table, which was so heaped with books and papers that nothing of him was visible from the door except a tuft of white hair. "My dear son," he said to me as I entered, It is a great grief to me that you are not more conversant with Sanskrit. When I was your age, I could converse not only in that noble language, but also in Tamulic, Lohitic, Jangelic, Take, and Malaic dialects, which are all offshoots from the Turanian branch. I regret extremely, sir, I answered, that I have not inherited your wonderful talents as a polyglot. I have set myself a task, he explained, which, if it could only be continued from generation to generation in our family until it was completed, would make the name of West immortal. This is nothing less than to publish an English translation of the Buddhist Dharmas, with a preface giving an idea of the position of Brahmanism before the coming of Sakyamuni. With diligence, it is possible that I might be able myself to complete part of the preface before I die. And pray, sir, I asked, how long would the whole work be when it was finished? The abridged edition in the Imperial Library of Peking, said my father, rubbing his hands together, consists of 325 volumes of an average weight of 5 pounds. Then tile preface, which must embrace some account of the Rig Veda, the Samaveda, the Yagur Veda, the Atharva Veda, with the Brahmanas, could hardly be completed in less than 10 volumes. Now, if we apportion 1 volume to each year, there is every prospect of the family coming to an end of its task about the date 2250. The 12th generation completing the work, while the 13th might occupy itself upon the index. And how are our descendants to live, sir? I asked with a smile, during the progress of this great undertaking. That's the worst of you, Jack, my father cried petulantly. There is nothing practical about you. Instead of confining your attention to the working out of my noble scheme, you begin raising all sorts of absurd objections. It is a mere matter of detail how our descendants live, so long as they stick to the dharmas. Now I want you to go up to the bothy of Fergus MacDonald and see about the thatched, and Willie Fulton has written to say that his milk cow is bad. You might look in upon your way and ask after it. I started off upon my errands, but before doing so I took a look at the barometer upon the wall. The mercury had sunk to the phenomenal point of 28 inches. Clearly the old sailor had not been wrong in his interpretation of nature's signs. As I returned over the moors in the evening, the wind was blowing in short, angry puffs, and the western horizon was heaped with somber clouds which stretched their long, ragged tentacles right up to the zenith. Against their dark background, 1 or 2 livid, sulphur-colored splotches showed up malignant and menacing, while the surface of the sea had changed from the appearance of burnished quicksilver to that of ground glass. A low, moaning sound rose up from the ocean, as if it knew that trouble was in store for it. Far out in the channel, I saw a single, panting, eager steam vessel making its way to Belfast Loch, and the large bark, which I had observed in the morning, still beating about in the offing, endeavoring to pass to the northward. At 9 o'clock, a sharp breeze was blowing. At 10, it had freshened into a gale, and before midnight, the most furious storm was raging, which I can remember upon that weather-beaten coast. I sat for some time in our small, oak-paneled sitting room, listening to the screeching and howling of the blasts, and to the rattle of the gravel and pebbles as they pattered against the window. Nature's grim orchestra was playing its world-old piece with a compass, which ranged from the deep diapason of the thundering surge to the thin shriek of the scattered shingle, and the keen piping of frightened seabirds. Once for an instant I opened the lattice window, but a gust of wind and rain came blustering through, bearing with it a great sheet of seaweed, which flapped upon the table. It was all I could do to close it again with a thrust of my shoulder in the face of the blast. My sister and father had retired to their rooms, but my thoughts were too active for sleep, so I continued to sit and to smoke by the smoldering fire. What was going on in the hall now, I wondered? What did Gabriel think of the storm, and how did it affect the old man who wandered about in the night? Did he welcome these dread forces of nature as being of the same order of things as his own tumultuous thoughts? It was only 2 days now from the date which I had been assured was to mark a crisis in his fortunes. Would he regard this sudden tempest as being in any way connected with the mysterious fate which threatened him? Over all these things and many more I pondered as I sat by the glowing embers until they died gradually out, and the chill night air warned me that it was time to retire. I may have slept a couple of hours when I was awakened by someone tugging furiously at my shoulder. Sitting up in bed, I saw by the dim light that my father was standing half-clad by my bedside, and that it was his grasp which I felt on my nightshirt. "Get up, Jack! Get up!" he was crying excitedly. "There's a great ship ashore in the bay, and the poor folk will all be drowned. Come down, my boy, and let us see what we can do." The good old man seemed to be nearly beside himself with excitement and impatience. I sprang from my bed and was hurtling on a few clothes when a dull, booming sound made itself heard above the howling of the wind and the thunder of the breakers. "There it is again!" cried my father. "It is their signal gun, poor creatures. Jameson and the fishermen are below. Put on your oilskin coat on and the Glengarry hat. Come, come! Every second may mean a human life." We hurried down together and made our way to the beach, accompanied by a dozen or so of the inhabitants of Branksome. The gale had increased rather than moderated, and the wind screamed all around us with infernal clamor. So great was its force that we had to put our shoulders against it and bore our way through it, while the sand and gravel tingled up against our faces. It was just light enough to make out the scuttling clouds and the white gleam of the breakers, but beyond that was absolute darkness. We stood ankle-deep in the shingle and seaweed, shading our eyes with our hands and peering out into the inky obscurity. It seemed to me, as I listened, that I could hear human voices, loud entreaty and terror, but amid the wild turmoil of nature, it was difficult to distinguish one sound from another. Suddenly, however, a light glimmered in the heart of the tempest, and next instant the beach and sea and wide tossing bay were brilliantly illuminated by the wild glare of a signal light. The ship lay on her beam ends right in the center of the terrible Hansel Reef, hurled over to such an angle that I could see all the planking of her deck. I recognized her at once as being the same three-masted bark which I had observed in the channel in the morning, and the Union Jack, which was nailed upside down to the jagged slump of her mizzen, proclaimed her nationality. Every spar and rope and writhing piece of cordage showed up hard and clear under the vivid light, which spluttered and flickered from the highest portion of the forecastle. Beyond the doomed ship, out of the great darkness came the long, rolling lines of big waves, never-ending, never-tiring, with a petulant turf of foam here and there upon their crests. Each, as it reached the broad circle of unnatural light, appeared to gather strength and volume, and to hurry on more impetuously, until with a roar and a jarring crash it sprang upon its victim. Clinging to the weather shrouds, we could distinctly see 10 or a dozen frightened seamen, who, when the light revealed our presence, turned their white faces toward us and waved their hands imploringly. The poor wretches had evidently taken fresh hope from our presence, though it was clear that their own boats had either been washed away or so damaged as to render them useless. The sailors who clung to the rigging were not, however, the only unfortunates on board. On the breaking poop there stood 3 men who appeared to be both of a different race and nature from the cowering wretches who implored our assistance. Leaning upon the shattered taffrail, they seemed to be conversing together as quietly and unconcernedly as though they were unconscious of the deadly peril which surrounded them. As the signal light flickered over them, we could see from the shore that these immutable strangers wore red fezzes, and that their faces were of swarthy, large-featured type, which proclaimed an Eastern origin. There was little time, however, for us to take note of such details. The ship was breaking rapidly, and some effort must be made to save the poor, sodden group of humanity who implored our assistance. The nearest lifeboat was in the Bay of Luce, 10 long miles away. But here was our own broad, roomy craft upon the shingle, and plenty of brave fisher lads to form a crew. 6 of us sprang to the oars. The others pushed us off, and we fought our way through the swirling, raging waters, staggering and recoiling before the great sweeping billows, but still steadily decreasing the distance between the bark and ourselves. It seemed, however, that our efforts were fated to be in vain. As we mounted upon the surge, I saw a giant wave topping all the others and coming after them like a driver following a flock, sweep down upon the vessel, curling its great green arch over the breaking deck. With a rending, riving sound, the ship split in two, where the terrible serrated back of the Hansel reef was sawing into her keel. The after part, with the broken mizzen and the three Orientals, sank backwards into deep water and vanished, while the forehalf oscillated helplessly about, retaining its precarious balance upon the rocks. A wail of fear went up from the wreck and was echoed from the beach, but by the blessing of Providence she kept afloat until we made our way under her bowsprit and rescued every man of the crew. We had not got halfway upon our return, however, when another great wave swept the shattered forecastle off the reef and, extinguishing the signal light, hid the wild denouement from our view. Our friends upon the shore were loud in congratulation and praise, nor were they backward in welcoming and comforting the castaways. They were 13 in all, as cold and cowed as a set of mortals as ever slipped through death's fingers, save indeed their captain, who was a hearty, robust man, and who made light of the affair. Some were taken off to this cottage and some to that, but the greater part came back to Branksome with us, where we gave them such dry clothes as we could lay our hands on, and served them with beef and beer by the kitchen fire. The captain, whose name was Meadows, compressed his bulky form into a suit of my own and came down to the parlour, where he mixed himself some grog and gave my father and myself an account of the disaster. "If it hadn't been for you, sir, and your brave fellows," he said, smiling across at me, "we should be 10 fathoms deep by this time. As to the Belinda, she was a leaky old tub and well insured, so neither the owners nor I are likely to break our hearts over her." "I am afraid," said my father sadly, "that we shall never see your 3 passengers again. I have left men upon the beach in case they should be washed up, but I fear it is hopeless. I saw them go down when the vessel split, and no man could have lived for a moment among that terrible surge." "Who were they?" I asked. I could not have believed that it was possible for men to appear so unconcerned in the face of such imminent peril. "As to who they are or were," the captain answered, puffing thoughtfully at his pipe, "that is by no means easy to say. Our last port was Kurachi in the north of India, and there we took them aboard as passengers for Glasgow. Ram Singh was the name of the younger, and it is only with him that I have come in contact, but they all appeared to be quiet, inoffensive gentlemen. I never inquired their business, but I should judge that they were Parsee merchants from Hyderabad, whose trade took them to Europe. I could never see why the crew should fear them, and the mate, too. He should have had more sense." "Fear them, I ejaculated in surprise. "Yes. They had some preposterous idea that they were dangerous shipmates. I have no doubt if you were to go down into the kitchen now, you would find that they're all agreed that our passengers were the cause of the whole disaster." As the captain was speaking, the parlour door opened, and the mate of the bark, a tall, red-bearded sailor, stepped in. He had obtained a complete rig-out from some kind-hearted fisherman, and looked in his comfortable jersey and well-greased sea boots a very favourable specimen of a shipwrecked mariner. With a few words of grateful acknowledgment of our hospitality, he drew a chair up to the fire and warmed his great brown hands before the blaze. "What did you think now, Captain Meadows?" he asked presently, glancing up at his superior officer. "Didn't I warn you what would be the upshot of having those niggers on board the Belinda?" The captain leaned back in his chair and laughed heartily. "Didn't I tell you?" he cried, appealing to us. "Didn't I tell you?" "It might have been no laughing matter for us," the other remarked, petulantly. "I have lost a good sea kit, and nearly my life into the bargain." "Do I understand you to say," said I, "that you attribute your misfortunes to your ill-fated passengers?" The mate opened his eyes at the adjective. "Why ill-fated, sir?" he asked. "Because they are most certainly drowned," I answered. He sniffed incredulously and went on warming his hands. "Men of that kind are never drowned," he said after a pause. "Their father, the devil, looks after them. Did you see them standing on the poop and rolling cigarettes at a time when the mizzen was carried away and the quarter-boats stove? That was enough for me. I'm not surprised at you landsmen not being able to take it in, but the captain here, who's been sailing since he was the height of the binnacle, ought to know by this time that a cat and a priest are the worst cargo you can carry. If a Christian priest is bad, I guess an idolatrous pagan one is 50 times worse. I stand by the old religion, and to it." My father and I could not help laughing at the rough sailor's very unorthodox way of proclaiming his orthodoxy. The mate, however, was evidently in deadly earnest, and proceeded to state his case, marking off the different points upon the rough, red fingers of his left hand. "It was at Currachee, directly after they come, that I warned you," he said reproachfully to the captain. "There were 3 Buddhist lascars in my watch. And what did they do when them chaps come on board? Why, they down on their stomachs and rubbed their noses on the deck. That's what they did. They wouldn't have done as much for an admiral of the Royal Navy. They know who's who, these niggers do, and I smelt mischief at the moment I saw them on their faces. I asked them afterwards, in your presence, Captain, why they had done it, and they answered that the passengers were holy men. You heard 'em yourself." "Well, there's no harm in that, Hawkins," said Captain Meadows. "I don't know that," the mate said doubtfully. "The holiest Christian is the one that's nearest God, but the holiest nigger is, in my opinion, the one that's nearest the devil. Then you saw yourself, Captain Meadows, how they went on during the voyage, reading books that was writ on wood instead of paper, and sitting right through the night to jabber together on the quarter-deck. What did they want to have a chart of their own for, and to mark the course of the vessel every day?" "They didn't," said the captain. "Indeed they did, and I did not tell you sooner. It was because you were always ready to laugh at what I said about them. They had instruments of their own. When they used them, I can't say, but every day at noon they worked out the latitude and longitude and marked out the vessel's position on a chart that was pinned on their cabin table. I saw them at it, and so did the steward from his pantry." "Well, I don't see what you proved from that," the captain remarked, "though I confess it is a strange thing." "I'll tell you another strange thing," said the mate impressively. "Do you know the name of this bay in which we are cast away?" "I have learned from our kind friends here that we are upon the Wigtownshire coast," the captain answered, "but I have not heard the name of the bay." The mate leaned forward with a grave face. "It is the Bay of Kirkmaiden," he said. If he expected to astonish Captain Meadows, he certainly succeeded, for that gentleman was fairly bereft of speech for a minute or more. "This is really marvelous," he said, after a time turning to us. "These passengers of ours cross-questioned us early in tile voyage as to the existence of a bay of that name. Hawkins here and I denied all knowledge of one, for on the chart it is included in the Bay of Luce. That we should eventually be blown into it and destroyed is an extraordinary coincidence." "Too extraordinary to be coincidence," growled the mate. "I saw them during the calm yesterday morning pointing to the land over our starboard quarter. They knew well enough that that was the port they were making for." "What do you make of it all, then, Hawkins?" asked the captain with a troubled face. "What is your own theory on the matter?" "Why, in my opinion," the mate answered, "them 3 swabs have no more difficulty in raising a gale of wind than I should have in swallowing this here grog. They had reasons of their own for coming to this godforsaken 7 your present, sirs, this godforsaken bay, and they took a short cut to it by arranging to be blown ashore there. That's my idea of the matter, though what 3 Buddhist priests could find to do in the Bay of Kirkmaiden is clean past my comprehension." My father raised his eyebrows to indicate the doubt which his hospitality forbade him from putting into words. "I think, gentlemen," he said, "that you are both sorely in need of rest after your perilous adventures. If you will follow me, I shall lead you to your rooms." He conducted them with old-fashioned ceremony to the laird's best spare bedroom, and then, returning to me in the parlour, proposed that we should go down together to the beach and learn whether anything fresh had occurred. The first pale light of dawn was just appearing in the east when we made our way for the second time to the scene of the shipwreck. The gale had blown itself out, but the sea was still very high, and all inside the breakers was seething, gleaming line of foam, as though the fierce old ocean were gnashing its white fangs at the victims who had escaped from its clutches. All along the beach, fishermen and crofters were hard at work, hauling up spars and barrels as fast as they tossed ashore. None of them had seen any bodies, however, and they explained to us that only such things as could float had any chance of coming ashore, for the undercurrent was so strong that whatever was beneath the surface must infallibly be swept out to sea. As to the possibility of the unfortunate passengers having been able to reach the shore, these practical men would not hear of it for a moment, and showed us conclusively that if they had not been drowned, they must have been dashed to pieces upon the rocks. "We did all that could be done," my father said sadly, as we returned home. "I am afraid that the poor mate has had his reason affected by the suddenness of the disaster." "Did you hear what he said about the Buddhist priests raising a gale?" "Yes, I heard him," said I. "It was very painful to listen to him," said my father. "I wonder if he would object to my putting a small mustard plaster under each of his ears. It would relieve any congestion of the brain. Or perhaps it would be best to wake him up and give him 2 antibulus pills. What do you think, Jack?" "I think," said I with a yawn, "that you had best let him sleep and go to sleep yourself. You can psych him in the morning if he needs it." So saying, I stumbled off to my bedroom and, throwing myself upon the couch, was soon in a dreamless slumber. End of chapter, read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Mystery of Cloomber by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 12 of the 3 Foreign Men upon the Coast. It must have been 11 or 12 o'clock before I awoke, and it seemed to me in the flood of golden light which streamed into my chamber that the wild, tumultuous episodes of the night before must have formed part of some fantastic dream. It was hard to believe that the gentle breeze, which whispered so softly among the ivy leaves around my window, was caused by the same element which had shaken the very house a few short hours before. It was as if nature had repented of her momentary passion, and was endeavoring to make amends to an injured world by its warmth and its sunshine. A chorus of birds in the garden below filled the whole air with their wonder and congratulations. Down in the hall I found a number of the shipwrecked sailors, looking all the better for their night's repose, who set up a buzz of pleasure and gratitude upon seeing me. Arrangements had been made to drive them to Wigtown, whence they were to proceed to Glasgow by the evening train, and my father had given orders that each should be served with a packet of sandwiches and hard-boiled eggs to sustain him on the way. Captain Meadows thanked us warmly in the name of his employers for the manner in which we had treated them, and he called for 3 cheers from his crew, which were heartily given. He and the mate walked down with us after we had broken our fast to have a last look at the scene of the disaster. The great bosom of the bay was still heaving convulsively, and its waves were breaking into sobs against the rocks. But there was none of that wild turmoil which we had seen in the early morning. The long emerald ridges, with their little white crests of foam, rolled slowly and majestically in, to break, with a regular rhythm, the panting of a tired monster. A cable length from the shore we could see the main mast of the bark floating upon the waves, disappearing at times in the trough of the sea, and then shooting up towards heaven, like a giant javelin, shining and dripping as the rollers tossed it about. Other smaller pieces of wreckage dotted the waters, while innumerable spars and packages were littered over the sands. These were being drawn up and collected in a place of safety by gangs of peasants. I noticed that a couple of broad-winged gulls were hovering and skimming over the scene of the shipwreck, as though many strange things were visible to them beneath the waves. At times, we could hear their raucous voices as they cried to one another of what they saw. "She was a leaky old craft," said the captain, looking sadly out to sea. "But there's always a feeling of sorrow when we see the last of a ship we have sailed in." Well, she would have broken up in any case and sold for firewood. "It looks a peaceful scene," I remarked. "Who would imagine that 3 men lost their lives last night in those very waters?" "Poor fellows," said the captain with feeling. "Should they be cast up after our departure, I am sure, Mr. West, that you will have them decently interred." I was about to make some reply when the mate burst into a loud guffaw, slapping his thigh and choking with merriment. "If you want to bury 'em," he said, "you had best look sharp, or they may clear out of the country. You remember what I said last night? Just look at the top of that hillock and tell me whether I was in the right or not." There was a high sand dune some little distance along the coast, and upon the summit of this the figure was standing which had attracted the mate's attention. The captain threw up his hands in astonishment as his eyes rested upon it. "By the Eternal," he shouted, "it's Ram Singh himself! Let us overhaul him!" Taking to his heels in his excitement, he raced along the beach, followed by the mate and myself, as well as by 1 or 2 of the fishermen, who had observed the presence of the stranger. The latter, perceiving our approach, came down from his post of observation and walked quietly in our direction, with his head sunk upon his breast like one who is absorbed in thought. I could not help contrasting our hurried and tumultuous advance with the gravity and dignity of this lonely Oriental. Nor was the matter mended when he raised a pair of steady, thoughtful, dark eyes and inclined his head in a graceful, sweeping salutation. It seemed to me that we were like a pack of schoolboys in the presence of a master. The stranger's broad, unruffled brow, his clear, searching gaze, firm-set, sensitive mouth, and clean-cut, resolute expression all combined to form the most imposing and noble presence which I had ever known. I could not have imagined that such imperturbable calm, and at the same time such a consciousness of latent strength, could have been expressed by any human face. He was dressed in a brown velveteen coat, loose, dark trousers, with a shirt that was cut low in the collar so as to show the muscular brown neck. And he still wore the red fez, which I had noticed the night before. I observed, with a feeling of surprise as we approached him, that none of these garments showed the slightest indication of the rough treatment and wetting which they must have received during their wearer's submersion and struggle to the shore. "So you are none for the worse for your ducking," he said in a pleasant musical voice, looking from the captain to the mate. "I hope that your poor sailors have found pleasant quarters." "We are all safe," the captain answered, "but we had given you up for lost, you and your 2 friends. Indeed, I was just making arrangements for your burial with Mr. West here." The stranger looked at me and smiled. "We won't give Mr. West that trouble for a little time yet," he remarked. "My friends and I came ashore all safe, and we have found shelter in a hut a mile or so along the coast. It is lonely down there, but we have everything which we can desire." "We start off for Glasgow this afternoon," said the captain. "I shall be very glad if you will come with us. If you have not been in England before, you may find it awkward traveling alone." "We are very much indebted to you for your thoughtfulness," Ram Singh answered, "but we will not take advantage of your kind offer. Since nature has driven us here, we intend to have a look about us before we leave." "As you like," the captain said, shrugging his shoulders. "I don't think you are likely to find very much to interest you in this hole of a place." "Very possibly not," Ram Singh answered with an amused smile. "You remember Milton's lines? The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a hell of heaven, a heaven of hell." "I dare say we can spend a few days here comfortably enough. Indeed, I think you must be wrong in considering this to be a barbarous locality. I am much mistaken if this young gentleman's father is not Mr. James Hunter West, whose name is known and honored by the pundits of India." "My father is indeed a well-known Sanskrit scholar," I answered in astonishment. "The presence of such a man," observed the stranger slowly, "changes a wilderness into a city. One great mind is surely a higher indication of a civilization than our incalculable leagues of bricks and mortar." "Your father is hardly so profound as Sir William Jones, or so universal as the Baron von Hammer-Purgstall, but he combines many of the virtues of each. You may tell him, however, from me, that he is mistaken in the analogy which he has traced between the Samoyed and the Tamulic word roots." "If you have determined to honor our neighborhood by a short stay," said I, "you will offend my father very much if you do not put up with him. He represents the laird here, and it is the laird's privilege, according to our Scottish custom, to entertain all strangers of repute who visit this parish." My sense of hospitality prompted me to deliver this invitation, though I could feel the mate twitching at my sleeves as if to warn me that the offer was, for some reason, an objectionable one. His fears were, however, unnecessary, for the stranger signified by a shake of his head that it was impossible for him to accept it. "My friends and I are very much obliged to you," he said, "but we have our own reasons for remaining where we are. The hut which we occupy is deserted and partly ruined, but we Easterns have trained ourselves to do without most of those things which are looked upon as necessities in Europe, believing firmly in that wise axiom that a man is rich not in proportion to what he has, but in proportion to what he can dispense with. A good fisherman supplies us with bread and with herbs. We have clean, dry straw for our couches. What could man wish for more?" "But you must feel the cold at night coming straight from the tropics," remarked the captain. "Perhaps our bodies are cold sometimes. We have not noticed it. We have all three spent many years in the upper Himalayas, on the border of the region of eternal snow, so we are not very sensitive to inconveniences of that sort." "At least," said I, "you must allow me to send you over some fish and some meat from our larder." "We are not Christians," he answered, "but Buddhists of the higher school. We do not recognize that man has a moral right to slay an ox or a fish for the gross use of his body. He has not put life into them, and has assuredly no mandate from the Almighty to take life from them, save under most pressing need. We could not, therefore, use your gift if you were to send it." "But, sir," I remonstrated, "if in this changeable and inhospitable climate you refuse all nourishing food, your vitality will fail. You will die." "We shall die, then," he answered with an amused smile. "And now, Captain Meadows, I must bid you adieu, thanking you for your kindness during the voyage, and you, too, goodbye. You will command a ship of your own before the year is out, I trust, Mr. West, that I may see you again before I leave this part of the country. Farewell." He raised his red fez, inclined his noble head with the stately grace which characterized all his actions, and strode away in the direction from which he had come. "Let me congratulate you, Mr. Hawkins," said the captain to the mate as we walked homewards. "You are to command your own ship within the year." "No such luck," the mate answered with a pleased smile upon his mahogany face. "Still, there's no saying how things may come out. What do you think of him, Mr. West?" "Why," said I am very much interested in him. What a magnificent head and bearing he has for a young man. I suppose he cannot be more than 30. 40, said the mate. 60 if he's a day, remarked Captain Meadows. Why, I have heard him talk quite familiarly of the first Afghan war. He was a man then, and that is close to 40 years ago. Wonderful, I ejaculated. His skin is as smooth as his eyes are as clear as mine are. He is the superior priest of the three, no doubt. The inferior, said the captain confidently. That is why he does all the talking for them. Their minds are too elevated to descend to mere worldly chatter. They are the strangest pieces of flotsam and jetsam that ever thrown upon this coast, I remarked. My father will be mightily interested in them. Indeed, I think the less you have to do with them, the better for you, said the mate. If I do command my own ship, I promise you that I'll never carry livestock of that sort on board of her. But here we are, all aboard, and the anchor's tripped, so we must bid you goodbye. The wagonette had just finished loading up when we arrived, and the chief places on either side of the driver had been reserved for my two companions, who speedily sprang into them. With a chorus of cheers, the good fellows whirled away down the road, while my father, Esther, and I stood upon the lawn and waved our hands to them until they disappeared behind the Cloomber woods, en route for Wigtown railway station. Bark and crew had both vanished now from our little world, the only relic of either being the heaps of debris upon the beach, which were to lie there until the arrival of an agent from Lloyd's. End of chapter, read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go. On the web at fcit.usf.edu. The Mystery of Cloomber by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Chapter 13th, in which I see that which has been seen by few. At dinner that evening I mentioned to my father the episode of the 3 Buddhist priests, and found, as I had expected, that he was very much interested by my account of them. When, however, he heard of the high manner in which Ram Singh had spoken of him, and the distinguished position which he had assigned him among philologists, he became so excited that it was all he could do to prevent him from setting off then and there to make his acquaintance. Esther and I were relieved and glad when we at last succeeded in abstracting his boots and maneuvering him to his bedroom, for the exciting events of the last 24 hours had been too much for his weak frame and delicate nerves. I was sitting at the open porch in the gloaming, turning over in my mind the unexpected events which had occurred so rapidly, the gale, the wreck, the rescue, and the strange character of the castaways, when my sister came quietly over to me and put her hand in mine. "Do you think, Jack," she said in her low, sweet voice, "that we are forgetting our friends over at Cloomber? Hasn't all this excitement driven their fears and their danger out of our heads?" "Out of our heads, but never out of our hearts," said I, laughing. "However, you are right, little one, for our attention has certainly been distracted from them. I shall walk up in the morning and see if I can see anything of them. By the way, tomorrow is the fateful 5th of October. One more day, and all will be well with us." "Or ill," said my sister gloomily. "Why, what a little croaker you are, to be sure," I cried. "What in the world is coming over you?" "I feel nervous and low-spirited," she answered, drawing closer to my side and shivering. "I feel as if some great peril were hanging over the heads of those we love. Why should these strange men wish to stay upon the coast?" "What, the Buddhists?" I said lightly. "Oh, these fellows have continual feast days and religious rites of all sorts. They have some very good reason for staying, you may be sure." "Don't you think," said Esther, in an awe-struck whisper, "that it is very strange that these priests should arrive here all the way from India just at the present moment? Have you not gathered from all you have heard that the general's fears are in some way connected with India and the Indians?" The remark made me thoughtful. "Why, now that you mention it," I answered, "I have some vague impression that the mystery is connected with some incident which occurred in that country. I am sure, however, that your fears would vanish if you saw Ram Singh. He is the very personification of wisdom and benevolence. He was shocked at the idea of our killing a sheep or even a fish for his benefit, said he would rather die than have a hand in taking the life of an animal." "It is very foolish of me to be so nervous," said my sister bravely, "but you must promise me one thing, Jack. You will go up to Cloomber in the morning, and if you can see any of them, you must tell them of these strange neighbors of ours. They are better able to judge than we are whether their presence has any significance or not." "All right, little one," I answered as we went indoors. "You have been overexcited by all these wild doings, and you need a sound night's rest to compose you. I'll do what you suggest, however, and our friends shall judge for themselves whether these poor fellows should be sent about their business or not." I made the promise to allay my sister's apprehension, but in the bright sunlight of morning it appeared less than absurd to imagine that our poor vegetarian castaways could have any sinister intentions, or that their advent could have any effect upon the tenant of Cloomber. I was anxious myself, however, to see whether I could see anything of the Heatherstones, so after breakfast I walked up to the hall. In their seclusion it was impossible for them to have learnt anything of recent events. I felt, therefore, that even if I should meet the General, he could hardly regard me as an intruder while I had so much news to communicate. The place had the same dreary and melancholy appearance which always characterized it. Looking through between the thick iron bars of the main gateway, there was nothing to be seen of any of the occupants. One of the great Scotch firs had been blown down in the gale, and its long, ruddy trunk lay right across the grass-grown avenue, but no attempt had been made to remove it. Everything about the property had the same air of desolation and neglect, with the solitary exception of the massive and impenetrable fencing, which presented as unbroken and formidable an obstacle as ever to the would-be trespasser. I walked around this barrier as far as our old trysting place, without finding any flaw through which I could get a glimpse of the house, for the fence had been repaired with each rail overlapping the last, so as to secure absolute privacy for those inside, and to block those peepholes which I had formerly used. At the old spot, however, where I had had the memorable interview with the General, on the occasion when he surprised me with his daughter, I found that the two loose rails had been refixed in such a manner that there was a gap of 2 inches or more between them. Through this I had a view of the house and part of the lawn in front of it, and though I could see no signs of life outside or at any of the windows, I settled down with the intention of sticking to my post until I had a chance of speaking to one or other of the inmates. Indeed, the cold, dead aspect of the house had struck such a chill into my heart that I determined to scale the fence at whatever risk of incurring the General's displeasure, rather than return without news of the Heatherstones. Happily, there was no need of this extreme expedient, for I had not been there half an hour before I heard the harsh sound of an opening lock, and the General himself emerged from the main door. To my surprise, he was dressed in a military uniform, and not the uniform in ordinary use in the British Army. The red coat was strangely cut and stained with the weather. The trousers had originally been white, but had now faded to a dirty yellow, with a red sash across his chest and a straight sword hanging from his side. He stood the living example of a bygone type, the John Company's officer of 40 years ago. He was followed by the ex-tramp, Corporal Rufus Smith, now well-clad and prosperous, who limped along beside his master, the two pacing up and down the lawn absorbed in conversation. I observed that from time to time one or the other of them would pause and glance furtively all around them, as though guarding keenly against a surprise. I should have preferred communicating with the general alone, but since there was no dissociating him from his companion, I beat loudly on the fencing with my stick to attract their attention. They both faced round in a moment, and I could see from their gestures that they were disturbed and alarmed. I then elevated my stick above the barrier to show them where the sound proceeded from. At this, the general began to walk in my direction with the air of a man who is bracing himself up for an effort. But the other caught him by the wrist and endeavored to dissuade him. It was only when I shouted out my name and assured them that I was alone that I could prevail upon them to approach. Once assured of my identity, the general ran eagerly toward me and greeted me with the utmost cordiality. "This is truly kind of you, West. It is only at such times as these that one can judge who is a friend and who not. I would not be fair to you to ask you to come inside or to stay any time, but I am nonetheless very glad to see you. I have been very anxious about you all," I said, "for it is some little time since I have seen or heard from any of you. How have you all been keeping?" "Why, as well as could be expected, but we will be better tomorrow." "We will be different men tomorrow, eh, Corporal?" "Yes, sir," said the corporal, raising his hand to his forehead in a military salute. "We'll be right as the bank tomorrow." "The corporal and I are a little disturbed in our minds just now," the general exclaimed. "But I have no doubt that all will come right. After all, there is nothing higher than Providence, and we are all in his hands. And how have you been, eh?" "We have been very busy, for one thing," said I. I suppose you have heard nothing of the great shipwreck." "Not a word," the general answered listlessly. "I thought the noise of the wind would prevent you hearing the signal guns. She came ashore in the bay the night before last, a great bark from India." "From India!" ejaculated the general. "Yes. Her crew were saved, fortunately, and have all been sent on to Glasgow." "All sent on?" cried the general, with a face as bloodless as a corpse. "All except 3 rather strange characters who claim to be Buddhist priests. They have decided to remain for a few days upon the coast." The words were hardly out of my mouth when the general dropped upon his knees, with his long, thin arms extended to heaven. "Thy will be done," he cried in a cracking voice. "Thy blessed will be done." I could see through the crack that Corporal Rufus Smith's face had turned to a sickly yellow shade, and that he was wiping the perspiration from his brow. "It's like my luck," he said, "after all these years to come, when I have got a snug billet." "Never mind, my lad," the general said, rising and squaring his shoulders like a man who braces himself for an effort. "Be it what it may, we'll face it as British soldiers should. Do you remember at Chilianwalla when you had to run from your guns to our square, and the Sikh horse came thundering down on our bayonets? We didn't flinch then, and we won't flinch now. It seems to me that I feel better than I have done for years. It was the uncertainty that was killing me." "And the infernal jingle-jangle," said the corporal. "Well, we all go together. That's some consolation." "Goodbye, West," said the general. "Be a good husband to Gabriel, and give my poor wife a home. I don't think she will trouble you long. Goodbye. God bless you." "Look here, General," I said, peremptorily, breaking off a piece of wood to make communication more easily. "This sort of thing has been going on too long. What are these hints and allusions and innuendos? It is time we had a little plain speaking. What is it you fear? Out with it! Are you in dread of these Hindus? If you are, I am able, on my father's authority, to have them arrested as rogues and vagabonds." No, that would never do," he answered, shaking his head. "You will learn about the wretched business soon enough. Mordaunt knows where to lay his hand upon the papers bearing on the matter. You can consult him about it tomorrow." "But surely," I cried, "if the peril is so imminent, something may be done to avert it. If you would but tell me what you fear, I should know how to act." "My dear friend," he said, There is nothing to be done, so calm yourself and let things take their course. It has been folly on my part to shelter myself behind these barriers of wood and stone. The fact is that inaction was terrible to me, and I felt that to do anything, however futile, in the nature of a precaution, was better than passive resignation. My humble friend here and I have placed ourselves in a position in which, I trust, no poor fellow will ever find himself again. We can only recommend ourselves to the unfailing goodness of the Almighty, and trust that what we have endured in this world may lessen our atonement in the world to come. I must leave you now, for I have many papers to destroy and much to arrange. Goodbye. He pushed his hand through the hold which I had made and grasped mine in a solemn farewell, after which he walked back to the hall with a firm and decided step, still followed by the crippled and sinister corporal. I walked back to Branksome much disturbed by this interview and extremely puzzled as to what course I should pursue. It was evident now that my sister's suspicions were correct, and that there was some very intimate connection between the presence of the three Orientals and the mysterious peril which hung over the towers of Cloomber. It was difficult for me to associate the noble-faced Ram Singh, gentle, refined manner and words of wisdom with any deed of violence, yet now that I had thought of it, I could see that a terrible capacity for wrath lay behind his shaggy brows and dark, piercing eyes. I felt that, of all men whom I had ever met, he was the one whose displeasure I should least care to face. But how could two men so widely disassociated as the foul-mouthed old corporal of artillery and the distinguished Anglo-Indian general have each earned the ill will of these strange castaways? And if the danger were a positive physical one, why should he not consent to my proposal to have the three men placed under custody, though I confess it would have gone much against my grain to act in so inhospitable a manner upon such vague and shadowy grounds? These questions were absolutely unanswerable, and yet the solemn words and the terrible gravity which I had seen in the faces of both the old soldiers forbade me from thinking that their fears were entirely unfounded. It was all a puzzle, an absolutely insoluble puzzle. One thing at least was clear to me, and that was that in the present state of my knowledge, and after the General's distinct prohibition, it was impossible for me to interfere in any way. I could only wait and pray that whatever the danger might be, it might pass over, or at least that my dear Gabriel and her brother might be protected against it. I was walking down the lane, lost in thought, and had got as far as the wicket gate, which opens upon the Branksome lawn, when I was surprised to hear my father's voice raised in a most animated and excited converse. The old man had been of late so abstracted from the daily affairs of the world, and so absorbed in his own special studies, that it was difficult to engage his attention upon any ordinary mundane topic. Curious to know what it was that had drawn him so far out of himself, I opened the gate softly, and walking quietly around the lower bushes, found him sitting, to my astonishment, with none other than the very man who was occupying my thoughts, Ram Singh, the Buddhist. The two were sitting upon a garden bench, and the Oriental appeared to be laying down some weighty proposition, checking every point upon his long, quivering brown fingers, while my father, with his hands thrown abroad and his face awry, was loud in protestation and argument. So absorbed were they in their controversy that I stood within a hand-touch of them for a minute or more before they became conscious of my presence. On observing me, the priest sprang to his feet and greeted me with the same lofty courtesy and dignified grace which had so impressed me the day before. "I promised myself yesterday," he said, "the pleasure of calling upon your father. You see, I have kept my word. I have even been daring enough to question his views upon some points in connection with the Sanskrit and Hindu tongues, with the results that we have been arguing for an hour or more without either of us convincing the other. Without pretending to as deep a theoretical knowledge as that which has made the name of James Hunter West a household word among Oriental scholars, I happen to have given considerable attention to this one point, and indeed I am in a position to say that I know his views to be unsound. I assure you, sir, that up to the year 700 or even later, Sanskrit was the ordinary language of the great bulk of the inhabitants of India. And I assure you, sir, said my father warmly, that it was dead and forgotten at that date, save by the learned, who used it as a vehicle for scientific and religious works, just as Latin was used in the Middle Ages, long after it had ceased to be spoken by any European nation. If you consult the Puranas, you will find, said Ram Singh, that this theory, though commonly received, is entirely untenable. And if you will consult the Ramayana, and more particularly the canonical books of the Buddhist discipline, cried my father, you will find that the theory is unassailable. But look at the Kulavaga, said our visitor earnestly, and look at King Azaka, shouted my father triumphantly, when in the year 300 before the Christian era, before, mind you, he ordered the laws of Buddha to be engraved upon the rocks, what language did he employ, eh? Was it Sanskrit? No! And why was it not Sanskrit? Because the lower orders of his subjects would not have been able to understand a word of it. Ha ha! That was the reason. How are you going to get around King Azoka's edicts, eh? He carved them in various dialects, Ram Singh answered. But energy is too precious a thing to be wasted in mere wind in this style. The sun has passed its meridian, and I must return to my companions. I am sorry that you've not brought them to see us, said my father courteously. He was, I could see, uneasy, lest, in the eagerness of debate, he had overstepped the bounds of hospitality. They do not mix with the world, Ram Singh answered, rising to his feet. They are of a higher grade than I, and more sensitive to contaminating influences. They are immersed in a 6 months' meditation upon the mystery of the third incarnation, which has lasted with few intermissions from the time that we left the Himalayas. I shall not see you again, Mr. Hunter West, and I therefore bid you farewell. Your old age will be a happy one, as it deserves to be, and your Eastern studies will have a lasting effect upon the knowledge and literature of your own country. Farewell. Am I also to see no more of you, I asked. Unless you will walk with me along the seashore, he answered. But you have already been out this morning and may be tired. I ask too much of you. Nay, I should be delighted to come, I responded from my heart. And we set off together, accompanied for some little distance by my father, who would gladly, I could see, have reopened the Sanskrit controversy, had not his stock of breath been too limited to allow of his talking and walking at the same time. He is a learned man, Ram Singh remarked, after we had left him behind. But, like many another, he is intolerant towards opinions which differ from his own. He will know better some day. I made no answer to this observation, as we trudged along for a time in silence, keeping well down to the water's edge, where the sands afforded a good foothold. The sand dunes which lined the coast formed a continuous ridge upon our left, cutting us off entirely from all human observation, while on the right the broad channel stretched away with hardly a sail to break its silvery uniformity. The Buddhist priest and I were absolutely alone with nature. I could not help reflecting that if he were really the dangerous man that the mate affected to consider him, well, that might be inferred from the words of General Heatherstone, I had placed myself completely in his power. Yet such was the majestic benignity of the man's aspect, and the unruffled serenity of his deep, dark eyes, that I could afford in his presence to let fear and suspicion blow past me as lightly as the breeze which whistled around us. His face might be stern and even terrible, but I felt that he could never be unjust. As I glanced from time to time at his noble profile and the sweep of his jet-black beard, his rough-spun tweed traveling suit struck me with an almost painful sense of incongruity, and I reclothed him in my imagination with the grand, sweeping Oriental costume which is the fitting and proper frame for such a picture, the only garb which does not detract from the dignity and grace of the wearer. The place to which he led me was a small fisher cottage which had been deserted some years before by its tenant, but still stood gaunt and bare, with the thatch partly blown away, and the windows and doors in sad disrepair. This dwelling, which the poorest Scotch beggar would have shrunk from, was the one which these singular men had preferred to the proffered hospitality of the laird's house. A small garden, now a mass of tangled brambles, stood around it, and through this my acquaintance picked his way to the ruined door. He glanced into the house, and then waved his hand for me to follow him. "You have now an opportunity," he said, in a subdued, reverential voice, "of seeing a spectacle which few Europeans have had the privilege of beholding. Inside that cottage you will find two yogis, men who are only one remove from the highest plane of adeptship. They are both wrapped in an ecstatic trance, otherwise I should not venture to obtrude your presence upon them. Their astral bodies have departed from them to be present at the Feast of Lambs in the holy lamasery of Rudok in Tibet. Tread lightly, lest by stimulating their corporal functions you recall them before their devotions are completed." Walking slowly and on tiptoe, I picked my way through the weed-grown garden and peered through the open doorway. There was no furniture in the dreary interior, nor anything to cover the uneven floor, save a litter of fresh straw in a corner. Among this straw 2 men were crouching, the one small and wizened, the other large-boned and gaunt, with their legs crossed in Oriental fashion, and their heads sunk upon their breasts. Neither of them looked up or took the smallest notice of our presence. They were so still and silent that they might have been 2 bronze statues, but for the slow and measured rhythm of their breathing. Their faces, however, had a peculiar ashen-gray color, very different from the healthy brown of my companions, and I observed, on stooping my head, that only the whites of their eyes were visible, the balls being turned upward beneath the lids. In front of them upon a mat lay an earthenware pitcher of water and half a loaf of bread, together with a sheet of paper inscribed with certain Kabbalistic characters. Ram Singh glanced at these and then, motioning to me to withdraw, followed me out into the garden. "I am not to disturb them until 10 o'clock, he said. "You have now seen in operation one of the grandest results of our occult philosophy, the dissociation of spirit from body. Not only are the spirits of these holy men standing at the present moment by the banks of the Ganges, but those spirits are clothed in a material covering so identical with their real bodies that none of the faithful will ever doubt that Lai Humi and Maudar Khan are actually among them. This is accomplished by our power of resolving an object into its chemical atoms, of conveying these atoms with a speed which exceeds that of lightning to any given spot, and from there reprecipitating them and compelling them to retake their original form. Of old, in the days of our ignorance, it was necessary to convey the whole body in this way, but we have since found that it was as easy and more convenient to transmit material enough merely to build up an outside shell or semblance. This we have termed the astral body. But if you can transmit your spirit so readily, I observed, why should they be accompanied by anybody at all? In communicating with brother initiates, we are able to employ our spirits only, but when we wish to come in contact with ordinary mankind, it is essential that we should appear in some form which they can see and comprehend. "You have interested me deeply in all you have told me," I said, grasping the hand which Ram Singh had held out to me as a sign that our interview was at an end. "I shall often think of our short acquaintance." "You will derive much benefit from it," he said, still holding my hand and looking gravely and sadly into my eyes. "You must remember that what will happen in the future is not necessarily bad, because it does not fall with your preconceived ideas of right. Be not hasty in your judgments. There are certain great rules which must be carried out at whatever cost to individuals. Their operation may appear to you to be harsh and cruel, but that is as nothing compared with the dangerous precedent which would be established by not enforcing them. The ox and the sheep are safe from us, but the man with the blood of the highest upon his hands should not and shall not live." He threw up his hands at the last words with a fierce, threatening gesture, and turning away from me, strode back to the ruined hut. I stood gazing after him until he disappeared through the doorway, and then started off for home, resolving in my mind all that I had heard, and more particularly this last outburst of the occult philosopher. Far on the right I could see the tall, white tower of Cloomber standing out clear-cut and sharp against the dark cloud bank which rose behind it. I thought how any traveller who chanced to pass that way would envy in his heart the tenant of that magnificent building, and how little they would guess the strange terrors, the nameless dangers which were gathering about his head. The black cloud rack was but the image, I reflected, of the darker, more sombre storm which was about to burst. Whatever it all means and however it happens, I ejaculated, God grant that the innocent be not confounded with the guilty. My father, when I reached home, was still in ferment over his learned disputation with the stranger. "I trust, Jack," he said, "that I did not handle him too roughly. I should remember that I am in loco magistri, and be less prone to argue with my guests. Yet, when he took up this most untenable position, I could not refrain from attacking him and hurling him out of it, which indeed I did, though you, who are ignorant of the niceties of the question, may have failed to perceive it. You observed, however, that my reference to King Azoka's edicts was so conclusive that he at once rose and took his leave." "You held your own bravely," I answered. "But what is your impression of the man now that you have seen him?" "Why," said my father, "he's one of those holy men who, under the various names of Sanakis, Yogis, Sevras, Qalandars, Hakims, and Kufis, have devoted their lives to the study of the mysteries of the Buddhist faith. He is, I take it, a theosophist, or worshipper of the god of knowledge, the highest grade of which is the adept. This man and his companions have not attained this high position, or they could not have crossed the sea without contamination. It is probable that they are all advanced Kalas who hope in time to attain to the supreme honor of adeptship. But, father, interrupted my sister, this does not explain why men of such sanctity and attainments should choose to take up their quarters on the shores of a desolate Scotch bay." "Ah, there you get beyond me," my father answered. "I may suggest, however, that it is nobody's business but their own, so long as they keep the peace and are amenable to the law of the land." "Have you ever heard," I asked, "that these higher priests, of whom you speak, have powers which are unknown to us?" "Why, Eastern literature is full of it. The Bible is an Eastern book, and it is not full of the record of such powers from cover to cover. It is unquestionable that they have in the past known many of nature's secrets which are lost to us. I cannot say, however, from my own knowledge, that the modern theosophists really possess the powers that they claim." "Are they a vindictive class of people?" I asked. "Is there any offense among them which can only be expiated by death?" "Not that I know of," my father answered, raising his white eyebrows in surprise. "You appear to be in an inquisitive humor this afternoon. What is the object of all these questions? Have our Eastern neighbors aroused your curiosity or suspicion in any way?" I parried the question as best as I might, for I was unwilling to let the old man know what was in my mind. No good purpose could come from this enlightenment. His age and his health demanded rest rather than anxiety, and indeed, with the best will in the world, I should have found it difficult to explain to another what was so very obscure to myself. For every reason, I felt that it was best that he should be kept in the dark. Never in all my experience had I known a day pass so slowly as did that eventful 5th of October. In every possible manner, I endeavored to while away the tedious hours, and yet it seemed as if darkness would never arrive. I tried to read. I tried to write. I paced about the lawn. I walked to the end of the lane. I put new flies upon my fishing hooks. I began to index my father's library. In a dozen ways I endeavored to relieve the suspense, which was becoming intolerable. My sister, I could see, was suffering from the same feverish restlessness. And again our good father remonstrated with us in his mild way for our erratic behavior and the continual interruption of his work which arose from it. At last, however, the tea was brought, and the tea was shaken, the curtains were drawn, the lamps lit, and after another interminable interval, the prayers were read and the servants dismissed to their rooms. My father compounded and swallowed his nightly jorum of toddy, and then shuffled off to his room, leaving the two of us in the parlour, with our nerves in a tingle and our minds full of the most vague and yet terrible apprehensions. End of chapter. Read by Jorge Acosta for Lit2Go on the web at fcit.usf.edu.